The mistress watched from the car. His mother held the funeral door open, and her husband, the man she loved, told her she didn't belong there. At her own father's funeral, people whispered as she walked away. That was the moment she stopped being his wife and became his consequence. The day of Eugene Calloway's funeral was cold and gray, the kind of mourning that sits heavy on your chest, like it already knows what you're carrying. The service was held at Calloway Memorial Chapel on the east side of Atlanta, a place that felt old and expensive at the same time, the kind of building that had seen more secrets than sermons. The flowers were white lilies arranged in long, solemn rows. The casket was dark mahogany, polished like it was built to outlast memory itself. The pews were full of people in tailored black clothing, people who moved through grief the same way they moved through everything, with composure and calculation and the practiced ease of those who have always had enough money to keep difficult things at a manageable distance. And in the front row, dressed in a simple black dress, with her hands folded quietly in her lap, sat a woman named Amina. She was 34 years old, quiet eyes, the kind of woman who didn't take up much space in a room, not because she had nothing to offer, but because she had spent most of her life learning how to make herself small for the comfort of other people. She had cried that morning before she left the house. She had cried in the car on the way over, one hand on the steering wheel, the other pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to keep something inside from getting out. But now, sitting in that front pew, she was still. She held herself together the way a person does when they know that if they let one crack form, everything will fall apart all at once. And this is not the place for that. Not today. She had not known Eugene Calloway well. That was what she told herself. What she knew was this. He was a man who had sent her letters every birthday since she was a little girl. Careful letters, never long, written in a steady and deliberate hand. He had sent a card the year she graduated from college. He had appeared briefly at her mother's funeral, standing at the far edge of the cemetery like a man who understood he did not have the right to stand closer, and he had left before she could speak to him. He had left a single white lily at Celestine's grave that she had found afterward and stood in front of for a long time without knowing why her throat felt so tight. She had always sensed there was a door somewhere between them that neither of them had been brave enough to open. Now the man was gone, and the door had died with him, unopened. She did not know, sitting in that front row, that the door had been opened for her. She did not know about the envelope that Eugene's attorney, a composed and careful man named Sterling Cole, had pressed into her coat pocket at the chapel entrance that morning with 4 words. He wanted you to have this today, not tomorrow, today. She had tucked it away without reading it. She wasn't ready. She was still grieving something she could not yet fully name. That was when Kofi arrived. Her husband walked into the chapel 18 minutes after the service began, which meant he walked in during the first hymn, which meant heads turned. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, handsome in the way that certain men are, the kind of handsome that had probably gotten him out of more trouble than it should have over the years. He wore a dark suit that was too well pressed for a man who had been indifferent about leaving the house that morning. Amina had asked him to come with her. He had told her he had a call. She had driven alone. Now he was here, but the way he moved through the chapel was not the way a husband moves toward his grieving wife. He looked around first. He took stock. He noticed the quality of the floral arrangements, the cut of the other attendees' clothing, the nameplate mounted near the entrance, Calloway Family Trust, and something shifted in his jaw, something measured and quietly interested. He slid into the pew beside Amina, and his first words to her were not, "I'm here," or "Are you all right?" His first words, spoken low and tight into the side of her face, were, "Why are you in the front row?" She looked at him. "They put me here," she said, keeping her voice below the music. He didn't like that answer. She could feel it in the way he stiffened. He glanced around at the others seated in the front rows. Men in expensive suits, women with pearls and careful posture, people who moved in circles Kofi had spent his entire career trying to enter. And here was his wife, seated among them as though she belonged. That bothered him in a way she couldn't explain and he would never admit. She could feel the discomfort radiating off of him. She looked back at the casket and breathed. Then Loretta arrived. Kofi's mother was a woman who had perfected the art of delivering cruelty in a whisper. She carried herself like the most important person in whatever room she entered, and she had spent enough years practicing that entrance that by now it was second nature. She found Amina in the front row with the precision of someone who had been keeping a long and careful inventory. She leaned down between Kofi and Amina, her perfume arriving a half-second before she did, and she said, her voice barely a murmur but edged like something cut to wound, "Amina, why are you sitting here? You are not family. This is embarrassing for all of us." She gestured toward the back of the chapel with two fingers, short and dismissive, the way you gesture when you are directing something you don't want to touch. Amina felt the blood drain from her face. She did not look around, but she felt the shift in the air. People nearby had heard. She could feel the weight of their attention without meeting a single pair of eyes. She pressed her hand against the pocket of her coat and felt the envelope beneath her fingers. She did not know yet what was inside. She only knew it was there. And then Kofi, her husband, the man she had cooked for and prayed over and stayed loyal to through years that had required real loyalty, her husband leaned to her ear and said, "She's right. You don't even know these people. Stop making this a scene. Let's go." There was nothing inside her at that moment that had words. She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, a slow and careful gesture, as if composing herself from the outside in. She picked up her small black purse, and she walked out. Out of the front row, out of the chapel, down the stone steps and into the cold air, while people turned and watched and whispered, and not one single person in that room said a word in her defense. Behind her, Loretta held the chapel door as Amina passed through it, a small proprietary gesture, like she was closing a door on something she had decided was finished. Outside, parked along the curb in Kofi's second car, a silver sedan that Amina was not supposed to know about, sat a woman named Desiree. She watched from the windshield as Amina came through the chapel doors. She watched Kofi follow behind, already unlocking his phone. She watched Loretta let the door swing shut, and Desiree, watching all of this from behind glass, smiled. Not wide, not loud, just a small, private, satisfied pull of the corners of her mouth. The smile of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular outcome and is now watching it arrive exactly on schedule. She had been patient. She had played her part carefully, and in that moment, behind that windshield, she felt certain she had won. Amina walked to her own car. She sat in the driver's seat and closed the door and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. One breath, then two, then three. Behind her, through the chapel's glass doors, the funeral director, a dignified older gentleman who had worked at Eugene Calloway's side for 22 years and understood more about this day than any other living person, watched Amina walk away with an expression that was not pity. It was something more complicated. The particular grief of a man who knows what is inside an envelope and understands that the woman who just walked through those doors has no idea how completely her life is about to change. To understand Amina, you have to go back. You have to go back to a small house on a red dirt road in rural Georgia, to a woman named Celestine, who raised her daughter on three things: dignity, silence, and the quiet and unshakable belief that every person carries more worth than the world bothers to acknowledge. Celestine was a seamstress. She worked from the back bedroom, early mornings and late evenings, bent over a sewing machine that hummed low and steady like a prayer that knew all the words. She was not a woman who complained. She was not a woman who spent energy explaining herself to people who had already decided what they thought. She loved Amina in the deep and steady way that some mothers love, not with many words, but with actions so consistent and so deliberate that the love became the atmosphere of the house itself. You didn't notice it because you were breathing it. It was just the air of that place. Amina grew up knowing two things about her father. One, that her mother had loved him. Two, that he was gone. Celestine never offered more than that, and Amina, who had understood from early on that her mother's silences were not empty but full, did not push. She watched instead. She watched the way Celestine's eyes shifted when a certain name was mentioned in passing. She watched for the letters that arrived every year around her birthday. No return address, a postmark from Atlanta, handwriting that was steady and careful and somehow familiar, even though she had never studied it long enough to know why. She watched for the single white lily that appeared on their porch on the anniversary of her birth, year after year, left by a hand she had never seen. On Amina's 16th birthday, Celestine sat beside her on the porch after the dinner dishes were cleared and placed something small and cool in her palm. A gold pendant, a half-moon shape, delicate and old, the kind of thing made to be passed down. "A man left this for you before you were born," Celestine said. Her voice was careful, the way it was when she was choosing words, the way a seamstress chooses thread, for exactly the right weight and color. He couldn't stay, but he never stopped. "One day you'll understand what I mean by that." She closed Amina's fingers over the pendant and held them there for a moment, warm and firm, and that was all she said. Amina wore that pendant from that evening forward, through high school, through the scholarship to a small college outside Savannah that had appeared in her senior year like a gift from a source she couldn't trace, through her mother's illness, through the hospital visits and the medical bills that somehow kept getting covered when by all rights they shouldn't have been, through Celestine's passing in Amina's 27th year, slow and then sudden the way these things go. Through all of it, the half-moon pendant stayed at her throat. It was the one thing she never removed. It was the thread connecting her to a story she did not yet know how to read. She had met Kofi 2 years after Celestine died. She had been lonely in the way that young women are lonely after burying their last parent, not just for company but for belonging, for the sense that she was tethered to something real in the world. Kofi was charming in those early years, present, the kind of man who made you feel like the most interesting and important person in the room when his attention was on you. He remembered small things. He called when he said he would. He took her to dinner and leaned across the table and looked at her like she was worth looking at, and after years of making herself small, that feeling had been close to overwhelming. She had loved him genuinely. She had brought all of herself into that marriage, the warmth of her mother's house, the discipline of how she had been raised, the deep and patient capacity for love that Celestine had modeled every day of Amina's life. She had set all of it down in that marriage with care, the way you furnish a home you intend to stay in. What she had not understood was that Kofi did not want her furnishings. He wanted the house. He wanted the steadiness of her, the quiet dignity of her, the way her presence made the rooms of his life feel solid. But he did not want the work of truly seeing her. He wanted a woman who completed the picture without demanding to be part of the conversation. And so over the years, slowly, the way water wears a stone down, nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to on any given Tuesday, Amina had gotten smaller, not in her heart, in her daily life, in the amount of space she allowed herself to occupy. She had learned to apologize for things that were not her fault. She had learned to stay quiet when Loretta came to visit and made her small comments in that particular whisper that was designed to land. She had learned that bringing her feelings to Kofi in the evenings led to a particular kind of conversation that circled back on itself until Somehow Amina was the one who needed to do better. She had loved him faithfully anyway. She had stayed. She had tried. Because that was the kind of woman Celestine had raised, and she had not yet understood that being faithful to someone who is not faithful to you is not a virtue. It is a wound you keep reopening by calling it love. And through all of those years, Eugene's letters had kept coming, one a year every birthday, brief and careful. I think of you often. I hope the year has been good to you. I am proud of who you are becoming, though I have no right to say so. She had kept every one of them in a shoebox beneath her bed. The paper had gone soft at the folds from being read and refolded so many times. She had never been able to write back. There was no return address to write to. She had simply held the letters and wondered every year what the full shape of the story was and when she would finally understand it. She had believed there was still time. She had not been wrong about everything, only about how much of it remained. In the weeks after Eugene Calloway's burial, Amina moved through her life like a woman walking underwater. Heavy, slow. She went to work. She came home. She cooked. She cleaned. She lay on her side of the bed in the dark, while Kofi breathed beside her, already asleep, entirely unbothered. She watched the ceiling. She thought about the funeral director's face as she walked out. She thought about Sterling Cole's words at the door. She thought about the envelope she had not yet opened, sitting in her coat pocket like a quiet stone. She had not called anyone. She had not told her two close friends what had happened at the chapel, because she did not yet have the words to explain a humiliation that still did not make full sense to her. She had not cried again since the day of the funeral, not because she did not feel it, but because something in her had gone beyond the reach of tears for the moment. She was in the particular numb that comes after too many things hit at once, when the heart shuts certain doors temporarily because it cannot process everything that is trying to get in at the same time. He had not asked her once how she was feeling since the funeral, not once in 3 weeks. He came home late without explanation. The second week, more frequently. She smelled the perfume before she saw any other evidence, something floral and deliberate that she did not own, left on his collar like a signature. She did not say anything. She had learned over years that bringing these things up only created a particular kind of conversation that ended with Amina apologizing for her own suspicion. So she stayed quiet. Loretta, in the meantime, had been busy. She had spent those weeks working the phones, cousins, church friends, the women from her Tuesday lunch group, anyone who would lend an ear. She told them that Amina had always been secretive, always a little odd, had always carried herself like she was above the family she had married into. She said that the scene at the funeral, sitting in the front row like she owned the place, was just the latest example of a woman who had never truly humbled herself. She delivered all of this in a tone of wounded concern, like a mother who was simply worried about her son, like everything she was saying came from a place of love and not from a place of territory. And Desiree moved closer, with the quiet patience of a woman who had been calculating for a long time. She appeared at Kofi's firm events, introduced herself to colleagues as his partner on a real estate venture, laughed at the right moments, touched his arm when she spoke. She told a mutual friend at a Sunday brunch, and she knew it would travel, that a man like Kofi needed someone who matched his level, that some women were content being invisible, and that was their choice, but a man with ambition needed someone who could stand beside him and be seen. She smiled when she said it. It was the most dangerous kind of statement, the kind that sounds almost like a compliment to someone else, while being a knife planted in the dark. One night at 2 a.m, with the house dark and Kofi asleep and the only sound, the distant hum of the city, Amina sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. She had been carrying it for 22 days. Every morning she had taken it from her coat pocket and held it. Every morning she had put it back. Maybe she was afraid of what was inside. Maybe she already sensed, somewhere deep and wordless, that whatever was in that envelope would change the shape of everything she thought she understood about her life. But that night she was done being afraid. She opened it. 3 things were inside. The first was a letter from Eugene Calloway, 6 pages handwritten, both sides of each page. In that same steady hand she had recognized from a lifetime of birthday letters. She read it slowly, the way you read something when you understand that each sentence matters. He had known about her before she was born. He had loved Celestine deeply and without apology, but Celestine had made a choice. She had seen the weight of the Calloway name, the politics of his world, the complexity that came with his family's money and power, and she had believed with everything in her that those things would crush the quiet, dignified life she wanted for her daughter. She had asked him to stay away. He had loved her enough to honor that. But he had never stopped watching. The scholarship that had arrived in Amina's senior year, the medical bills from Celestine's final years that had somehow been covered. Every single one of these things had been Eugene, quiet and steady and distant, loving her in the only way he was permitted. The second document was a legal paternity acknowledgement, signed, notarized, indisputable. Eugene Calloway was her biological father. She was his daughter. There was no ambiguity in it and no softening of language, just the plain and irreversible truth. The third was a formal notice from Calloway and Associates, attorneys at law. The document named her Amina Calloway, the name she had never been called, the name she had never known she had, as the sole beneficiary of the Calloway Family Trust. The assessed value was printed at the bottom of the page in plain, unhurried numbers, $30,214,000,000. She sat at that kitchen table until the sun came through the window. She did not cry. She was past crying. She sat with the weight of what she now knew, not the money, not yet, but the love behind it, the long and patient and imperfect love of a man who had spent her entire life quietly making sure she was all right. From a distance she had not chosen and he had not wanted, but both of them had lived inside. She pressed her fingers against the pendant at her throat, the half moon, and she understood, finally, what Celestine had meant all those years ago on the porch. He loved you in the only way he knew how, from a distance. Kofi came downstairs at 7. He walked past her without looking. He poured juice, he checked his phone. Then he glanced up and noticed something in her face. Still different, a quality of stillness that was not emptiness but the opposite of it. And he said, in that flat, dismissive tone she had learned to dread, "I need space. You're suffocating me just sitting there." He took his juice and went back upstairs. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at where he had stood. Then she folded the papers back into the envelope with great care, tucked it into her coat pocket, and picked up her phone. Sterling Cole answered on the second ring. "Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. "This is Amina, Eugene Calloway's daughter." The first time she had spoken those words aloud, they felt enormous and exact simultaneously. "I'm ready to proceed." 6 weeks later, the Calloway Foundation annual gala was held at the Grand Meridian Ballroom in downtown Atlanta, the most prestigious event in the city's philanthropic calendar, the kind of evening where Atlanta's old money and new ambition occupied the same room and nodded at each other across crystal glasses. The ballroom was dressed in deep navy and gold. The centerpieces alone cost more than most people's car payments. Every person in that room was someone who believed their presence in it confirmed something important about who they were. Kofi arrived with Desiree on his arm. He had told Amina nothing about the gala. He had been working on the Calloway Trust pitch for 4 months. The Peachtree Development Project would be, his firm's senior partner had told him, the deal that moved him from promising to established. He had rehearsed the pitch until it was smooth. He had a new suit. He stood at the entrance of that ballroom and felt like a man on the edge of everything he had been working toward his entire career. Loretta was at a table near the front, dressed in navy, already scanning the room with the comfortable survey of a woman who had decided the evening existed for her benefit. At 8:37 in the evening, the room shifted, not loudly. It started as something felt more than seen. A change in the quality of attention, the way people in a room instinctively orient when something real is about to happen. The gala host moved to the podium and cleared his throat with the particular gravity of a man who understands what he is about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we continue the evening's program, it is our profound privilege to make an introduction that has been a long time coming. Someone who has been working with great care and deliberateness over the past several weeks to honor the legacy of Eugene Calloway and lead the foundation into the next chapter of his vision. Please welcome, for the first time publicly, the new chair of the Calloway Family Foundation and sole heir to the Calloway Family Trust, Ms. Amina Calloway." She came through the side entrance. There was nothing loud about her entrance. No heavy diamonds, no performance, no dramatic orchestration. She wore a fitted black dress, clean and understated, and at her throat the small gold half-moon pendant her mother had placed in her hand on a Georgia porch 18 years ago. Sterling Cole walked 2 steps behind her. She moved through that room with the particular ease of someone who has finished being afraid, smooth and unhurried, taking each step with full intention. There was no rush in her. She had already arrived. She had been arriving her entire life. The room simply hadn't known where to look. The applause began before she reached the podium. It grew to a standing ovation. The entire room on its feet. Kofi did not stand. He sat with his glass suspended midway to his mouth and his face doing the particular thing a man's face does when the ground has moved beneath him and his body hasn't registered it yet. Desiree, beside him, had gone absolutely still, her expression locked somewhere between disbelief and calculation. Loretta, at her table near the front, turned slowly in her chair to look at the woman walking toward the podium. The woman she had pointed toward the back of a chapel 6 weeks ago. The woman she had whispered about to every person who would listen. And she looked at her with the expression of someone seeing a thing for the very first time, which in every way that counted she was. Amina spoke at the podium with brevity and authority. She spoke about her father's vision for the foundation. She spoke about the communities his work had served and the communities it would serve under her leadership. She did not look toward Kofi's table. She was not there for Kofi. After she stepped down, Sterling Cole appeared at her elbow with a leather portfolio, and then Kofi came across the room. He moved with the uncomfortable determination of a man who has not yet made peace with what is happening. He reached her near the tall windows and stood in front of her and just looked at this woman he had married. This woman he had watched be escorted out of her own father's funeral. This woman he had told was suffocating him by sitting quietly at a table at 7 in the morning. He looked at her, and she looked back at him with dark, steady eyes that held no anger, no satisfaction, nothing cutting, only a clarity so complete and so calm that it was almost impossible to hold her gaze. He had stood in front of that woman hundreds of times across the years of their marriage, and he had never truly seen her. He saw her now. He understood, in the way that a person understands something too late, exactly what he had been standing next to this whole time and what he had done with it. "Amina," he said, and his voice came out wrong, thinner than he had intended. She let the silence rest. 1 full breath. 2. And then she spoke the way a woman speaks when she has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in exactly the right place. "You told me I didn't belong at my father's funeral." Quiet. Level. the kind of voice that carries in a room that has gone still. "You were right. I didn't belong in the back. I belonged at the front, because he left me everything." She did not need to raise her voice. The people nearest them heard every word. Sterling Cole stepped forward and opened the portfolio and turned with composed and final courtesy to the representative from Kofi's firm, who had arrived at Kofi's elbow with a folder of presentation materials he was never going to use. "On behalf of the Callaway Trust," Sterling said, measured and without malice, but with the absolute permanence of a door being shut, "we'll be declining the partnership on the Peachtree development, effective as of this evening. We wish your firm continued success." 4 seconds of silence followed, the longest 4 seconds of Kofi's professional life. The consequences arrived the way consequences always do, not all at once, but in a steady procession, each day delivering something new for Kofi to lose. The firm's partners heard about the Callaway Trust withdrawal within 48 hours. By the end of that week, 2 other clients who had been watching the development of the Peachtree deal quietly moved their accounts elsewhere. In a business built entirely on reputation and relationship, a man whose wife had turned out to be the heir to $30 billion and whose first public response to that information was the embarrassment of a woman at her own father's funeral. That man became a story that people told at dinner parties, and not favorably. His phone got lighter. His calendar got quieter. The trajectory that had felt certain 2 months ago began to feel much less so. There were afternoons in that empty apartment when Kofi sat on the edge of the couch and tried to trace back the exact place where things had gone wrong. He told himself the story different ways. He told himself Amina had hidden things from him. He told himself the trust had complicated everything. He told himself that Loretta had been just trying to protect the family. He told himself that Desiree had been a mistake, yes, but a small one compared to everything else that had happened. He went through all the versions of the story where he was not the author of his own downfall, and he tried them all on, and none of them fit quite right. Because at the end of every version, there was still a woman in a black dress walking down Stone Chapel steps, while people whispered, and the man who put her there was still him. Desiree sent a text message on a Thursday afternoon. 14 words, 1 period. No apology, no phone call, no conversation. She had always been practical in the way that people are practical when they have been strategic from the beginning. There was no longer anything to gain, and she was not a woman who stayed in arrangements with no return. She moved on with the same quiet efficiency with which she had arrived, and the space she left behind was not emotional. It was the cold, drafty space of a man who realizes he was being managed and mistook it for being chosen. Loretta tried to run the story back. She called the family members and the church sisters and the Tuesday lunch women she had spent weeks informing about Amina's flaws, and she tried a different version, one where she had always seen something special in Amina, one where the funeral had been a misunderstanding, one where she was quietly proud of her daughter-in-law's success. She could hear the silence on the other end of those calls, the polite, careful silence of people who remember clearly what was said before and are now taking note of what is being said now. The invitations stopped coming without drama. There was no announcement, no confrontation. They simply stopped. And a woman who had organized her entire identity around where she was invited and how she was regarded by the right people discovered slowly that silence from those people is a verdict of its own. Amina received one phone call from Loretta. She looked at the name on the screen for several seconds. She let it ring through to voicemail. She did not call back. She did not need to. She simply did not answer, and that was the entirety of what she owed. She signed the final trust documents in Sterling Cole's office on a Tuesday morning in November, with Atlanta arranged outside the glass behind her. When the last signature was placed, she set the pen down and looked out at the city her father had loved, and she breathed. One long, full breath that had nothing theatrical about it. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Arrival. The feeling of finally standing in the place you were always supposed to be, after a very long road to get there. She drove back to Georgia on a Saturday in December, when the light was thin and clean and the trees had gone bare. The house on the red dirt road had been restored. New roof, same green shutters, the porch boards replaced but laid in the same pattern. Inside, no marble, no chandeliers, none of the things that would have made Celestine shift in her chair. Just warm light and clean space and the smell of cedar that had always lived in those walls. Just the house her mother had loved, given back to itself. Amina made tea and sat on the porch in the afternoon. The gold pendant lay at her throat in the winter light. That half moon her mother had pressed into her palm with words that had taken 18 years to fully understand. She held the cup in both hands and was still, the way Celestine had been still on this same porch, with her own quiet things arranged around her like company she had chosen carefully. Inside, above the fireplace, 2 photographs. Celestine, strong-faced and serene in her 30s, looking slightly to the side as if listening for something no one else could hear. And Eugene, not a formal portrait but a candid image Sterling had found in his personal files and sent to her without a note attached, because no note was needed. A younger man in a light jacket standing in a field, laughing with his head thrown back, open and unguarded and full of a joy that she recognized in herself sometimes. She had put them on the wall together. They looked, in their separate frames, like 2 people who had once shared the same light, and in some way that outlasted everything still did. She forgave him on that porch. Not for the distance. She had made peace with that at 2 in the morning over 6 pages of his handwriting. She forgave him for being human, for being afraid, for being a man who had loved her from a distance because the closeness was complicated and the distance was the only love he knew how not to cause harm with. She understood that kind of love now. She had seen it in Celestine too, in the way her mother had kept him away not from bitterness but from protection, and how that protection had cost Celestine something she carried in the quiet places she never talked about. She thought about her mother. She thought about the particular kind of strength that does not announce itself, that just shows up morning after morning and does what needs to be done and keeps its dignity regardless. Celestine had that strength. She had passed it down the way she passed the pendant down, without explanation, just the thing itself, placed in your hands, trusting you to one day understand its weight. Amina understood it now. She carried it now, not as something heavy, but as something true. She sat on the porch until the light went gold and then thin, and the first cold stars came out over the Georgia fields, and she thought about what it means to carry a name you don't know you have. She thought about all the rooms she had made herself small in. She thought about a folded envelope in a coat pocket at a funeral, about a kitchen table at 2 in the morning and documents that told the whole shape of a story she had been living inside without the full picture, about a woman who walked into a ballroom and simply told the truth and let the room absorb it. She was not bitter. She genuinely was not. Bitterness requires you to keep looking backward, and Amina had too much ahead of her to spend that kind of time. The Foundation's first scholarship initiative had been announced that month, funding for young women from small rural towns across the South, the kind of towns where girls grew up the way Amina had, in houses full of love and limited options, with the quiet dream of something larger pressing against the inside of them. The first class of recipients, 12 young women. When Amina had read their essays, she had pressed her hand flat against her chest, over the pendant, and closed her eyes. The moral of Amina's story is not about wealth. It was never about the wealth. It is about this. The people who dragged her out of that chapel had already decided what she was. They had looked at her and made a determination and arranged their behavior around that determination with the confidence of people who have never been wrong about something important. They saw a woman they had decided was small, and they treated her accordingly, and they were so certain of their version of her that it never once occurred to them to look again. They were wrong about everything, but more than that, she had always been worth seeing. Long before $30 billion, long before the gala and the applause and sterling coal and all the rest of it, she had been worth seeing the day she sat in that front row with folded hands and a broken heart, grieving a father she barely knew how to name. She had been worth seeing her whole life. They simply never looked. Some people's blessings are too big for small rooms, and sometimes God closes certain doors on you, not to punish you, but because the room you were always meant for is somewhere else entirely, somewhere larger, somewhere that already has your name on it. Amina had always been that room. It just took the rest of the world a little while to catch up. Amina never needed them to understand her worth. She just needed time. And if you're in a season where the people closest to you are the first ones to make you feel small, where you're being walked out of rooms that were always meant to hold you, let this be your reminder. Your blessing does not need their permission. Your name does not need their recognition. Your value was never determined by the people who mishandled you. It was already there. It has always been there, waiting for you to stand up straight and believe it yourself. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story is already waiting for you.